From the true beginning of the First Age to the end of the Third Age, around 11,500 years pass. During that time, we see the rise and fall of dozens of different kingdoms and realms, some of which last for thousands of years, others which last for a few hundred or even much, much less. So I thought it would be fun to delve through Middle-earth's vast history, look at every single realm, kingdom, lordship, refuge, whatever you want to call it, and rank them all, from the shortest lived to the longest lived by the time of the War of the Ring. Now just as a quick note, some of the places in this video had people living there for a long time. However, I am going off when that place became a state of sorts according to the lore. For example, we know Greenwood and Lothlorien had elves living in those places for a long time, but in the case of Greenwood, we know a state wasn't formed there until 750 of the Second Age. Likewise, we know Durin's folk had a colony at the Iron Hills for thousands of years, but as far as we're aware, a lordship wasn't established there until 2590. It's debatable whether you can call these places realms before that. For the sake of the video, I'm not going to argue it. Also, in regards to some places, we don't know exactly how old they are, so I'll give a range or an estimate, and for other places it's just impossible to know, so I won't bother. Okay, so what was the shortest lived state in Middle-earth? Well, it wasn't really much of a state at all, but rather a somewhat more organised outlaw country. I'm talking about Dor Cuarthol, the land of bow and helm, ruled by Turin Turambar and Belayed Strongbow. Founded in 487 of the First Age at a secret refuge on the hill of Amon Ruth, Dor Cuarthol would consist of a small territory around the hill where Morgoth's forces were temporarily driven back. Although Dor Cuarthol punched well above its weight, it could not really hope to properly contest Morgoth, and merely 2 years later, aided by internal betrayal, Amon Ruth was taken, Turin was captured, and Dor Cuarthol was no more. But if we're talking about more respectable states, then the shortest lived would be Balin's ill-fated colony in Moria. In 2989 of the Third Age, against the advice of King Dain Ironfoot, Balin decided to take a company of dwarves to Moria in an attempt to reclaim it for Durin's folk. At first, things went well. Balin's company kicked out the orcs and began to explore the dark depths of the fallen city. But not long afterwards, Erebor stopped receiving messages and the colony went dark. As the Fellowship discovered, in 2994 the orcs returned in number and the dwarven colonists were trapped and wiped out. Moria had been reclaimed for a mere 5 years. Fortunately, no other places were as short-lived as Balin's colony, but there were certainly lands where the inhabitants still didn't get much time. One of these lands was Ladros, a land in the northeastern highlands of Dorthonion that was granted to the House of Beor by Finrod Felagund in 410 of the First Age. Ladros would have 3 lords, Boromir, who ruled for 24 years, Bregor, who ruled for 16 years, and then Bregalas, but his reign would be cut short at a mere 7 years. In 455, Angband unleashed its armies in the Battle of Sudden Flame, and Ladros was amongst the first lands to fall. Although the remnants of the House of Beor did fight a guerrilla war for another few years, they never reclaimed their home. In the end, they had it for a mere 45 years. As you might expect, the end of the First Age saw a number of more short-lived realms simply due to how catastrophic it was. This time, it's Dorlomen, a fiefdom of Hiflum that was granted to the House of Hador in 416 of the First Age. It was also ruled by 3 lords, but rather fittingly for the time, none of these lords died of natural causes. Hador was slain in battle in 455, Galdor was slain in battle in 462, and Hurin was captured in 472 and later committed suicide. The battle where Hurin was captured was the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. In this battle, Dorlomen's entire force had perished, so the land, along with the rest of Hiflum, was defenseless. It was occupied by the Easterlings, and the remaining Hadorians lived as thralls. In the end, Dorlomen had lasted 56 years. And again, we have another realm from the First Age, the Havens of Sirion, which was a secret refuge founded by survivors from the Falas in 473 of the First Age. Over time, this refuge would grow, swelled by those who fled from the falls of many other realms such as Nargothrond, Doriath, and Gondolin. Men and elves would live side by side, and because it was relatively distant from the might of Morgoth, the place prospered for a time. And then, in 538, it came to a sudden tragic end. The Havens of Sirion were the location of the third kinslaying, led by the remaining sons of Feanor. The Havens were sacked, and the survivors fled to the Isle of Balar. In total, the Havens had lasted 65 years. Finally, we're moving away from the First Age. The next place is Isengard. Now, Isengard was around for thousands of years, but it was always a fortress of Gondor apart from a period of around 50 years where it was captured by Dunlendings. Then it was taken care of by Saruman for nearly 200 years in Gondor's name, at least in theory. But in practice, Isengard was independent, and in 2953, Saruman dropped any semblance of being a mere warden by fortifying Isengard for himself. At this point, he started truly getting up to no good, culminating with him fighting against the Free Peoples during the War of the Ring. He lost control of the fortress in 3019, ending Isengard as an independent power after 66 years. Next, we have a happier story because at the time of the War of the Ring, this realm is still going. I'm talking about the Kingdom of Dale. Now, the lands around Dale had been occupied by Northmen for a long time, and the city itself was founded sometime around 2590 of the Third Age. At this point, it seems to have just been a city-state, and then it was abandoned following Smaug sacking Erebor. However, after Smaug's death, Dale was reoccupied, and Bard the Bowman became the ruler of a new kingdom, which expanded its territory both east and south. By the time of the War of the Ring, Dale had 3 rulers: Bard, who ruled for 33 years, Bane, who ruled for 30 years, and Brand, who ruled for just 12 years. He was slain during the War of the Ring and was succeeded by Bard II. When Bard II came to the throne, the kingdom had existed for 78 years, and would presumably exist for many more. Next, we're back to the First Age, to the Forest of Brethil, the land of the last House of the Edain, the House of Halef. Now, we don't know the exact date the House of Halef were given Brethil. There's some contradictions in the sources. Some say that it was after Halef's death, who died in 420 of the First Age. Others say it was before. Regardless, we know how Brethil ended, not from Morgoth, but rather due to a civil war that occurred in 501, which resulted in the deaths of the last surviving members of the House of Halef. After that, most of the Halefians left the forest, and Brethil stopped existing as a functioning state. It had lasted for at least 80 years. Interestingly, not all places came to an end at the end of the First Age. One realm was abandoned nearer to the start, Vinyamar, the city that belonged to Turgon in Nevrast. We don't know when Vinyamar was founded exactly, but it was probably also in the year 7, like many other Noldoran lordships. However, Vinyamar was very short-lived by the standards of the elves. In the year 64, Turgon was already beginning the construction of Gondolin due to a vision received from Ulmo, and when that city was completed in 116, Vinyamar was abandoned and would remain empty for the rest of the First Age. It was home to Turgon and his followers for only 109 years. The next place is also from the First Age. This is the Isle of Balar. Like the Havens of Sirion, the refuge at the Isle of Balar was founded by survivors from the Falas in 473 of the First Age, and ended up being the home of Círdan and Gil-galad, although we're told the island could not support a huge number of people. Thanks to being across the water, the Isle of Balar was not attacked during the Third Kinslaying, and after the fall of the last elven possessions on the mainland, the Isle of Balar ended up being the last holding of elves and men in Beleriand. In 487, it was either destroyed during the sinking of Beleriand, or it was abandoned. Either way, the island did serve its purpose, having been a refuge for 114 years. Alright, now we have a fairly big jump. The next realm might surprise you, as in you wouldn't have expected it to be in the video. I'm talking about the rebel realm of Umbar, specifically that which was ruled by Castamir the Usurper's descendants, who seized the city in 1448 of the Third Age. Although they were initially rebels, they ended up ruling the city and the surrounding lands for centuries, existing as a rival state, and as the proto-Corsairs of Umbar, although I would argue that they were not the same entity. In 1810, King Telummatar Umbardakil of Gondor captured the city and wiped out the last of Castamir's descendants, effectively ending the rebel state. It had lasted as a major thorn in Gondor's side for 362 years. Up next is the Dwarven kingdom that existed in the Grey Mountains. After the fall of Khazad-dûm, Durin's folk founded a new kingdom at Erebor, but many of the dwarves actually ended up going to the Grey Mountains instead. In 2210 of the Third Age, Thorin I recognized which way the winds were blowing, and moved his kingship from Erebor to the Grey Mountains. The dwarves prospered there for many years, but in 2570, an old threat returned from the north: dragons. After a 20-year war, the dwarves realized that they could not win, and abandoned the Grey Mountains in favor of Erebor and the Iron Hills. Their kingdom there had lasted 380 years. The next place is one of Middle-earth's most famous kingdoms, Gondolin. Now, I already spoke a bit about Gondolin when I spoke about Vinyamar. It was founded because Turgon received a vision from Ulmo, construction began in 64 of the First Age, and it was completed in 116. Gondolin would be a hidden city, its exact location known only to those who lived there. This allowed it to outlast all of the other major kingdoms in Beleriand, which had either fallen to Morgoth or the Sons of Feanor. Unfortunately, it could not remain hidden forever. Thanks to betrayal from within, Morgoth learned of the city's location, and in 510 it was destroyed by his armies. It had lasted for 394 years. The next place I'll be talking about is, geographically, right next to Gondolin. I'm speaking of Minas Tirith, the First Age version, not the iconic one from the Third Age. Minas Tirith was built by Finrod Felagund to protect the pass of Sirion in 60 of the First Age, and upon completion of Nargothrond in 102, the island was handed over to Orodreth, Finrod's nephew. Orodreth would hold Minas Tirith until 457, when it was captured by Sauron and turned into a place of terror and fear. It had been in the hands of the Noldor for 397 years. It would not be in Sauron's hands for long either. In 465, Luthien drove out Sauron and destroyed the fortress. It was not rebuilt. Up next is the Iron Hills. Although Durin's folk have occupied the Iron Hills since the First Age, it seemingly officially only became a lordship in 2590. This was when the dwarves abandoned the Grey Mountains, and while Thror went to Erebor, his younger brother Gror went to the Iron Hills. After the sack of Erebor in 2770, the Iron Hills would only increase in importance and would be the main holding of Durin's folk up until 2941, when Erebor was retaken. As far as we're aware, the Iron Hills were still occupied at the end of the Third Age. This gives them 439 years. Up next is another of the First Age's legendary kingdoms, Nargothrond. Thanks to King Thingol of Doriath's help, Nargothrond was founded in 52 of the First Age, although the city itself was not completed until 102. Nargothrond was one of the most powerful elven kingdoms in Beleriand. After Finrod's death in 465, the kingship passed to his nephew, Orodreth, who unfortunately was a fairly weak leader. Turin Turambar convinced the king to abandon Nargothrond's method of secret warfare and instead march against Morgoth openly. In 495, the Battle of Tumhalad was fought. It went really bad. Orodreth was killed, and Nargothrond was destroyed. The kingdom had lasted for 443 years. We're still on the topic of Finrod Felagund because the next realm was actually his vassal, Dorthonion, founded by his younger brothers, Angrod and Aegnor, in 7 of the First Age. Dorthonion was an important realm. It occupied the highlands directly facing Angband, but because of this, it wasn't an attractive place to live, and the brothers' people were few, although they were hardy. Their small numbers were their undoing. During the Battle of Sudden Flame in 455, Dorthonion bore the brunt of the assault, the brothers were killed, and their realm came to an end. It had lasted for 448 years. You wouldn't believe it, but the next place is also from the First Age. This time we're talking about Hithlum, founded in 7 of the First Age and ruled over by High King Fingolfin and then Fingon. Hithlum was arguably the most important realm in the war effort against Morgoth, and because of this, Morgoth attacked it many times. Nevertheless, protected by mountains, Hithlum survived up until the Battle of Unnumbered Tears in 472. Most of Hithlum's army was destroyed in the battle, and the realm was left defenseless against Morgoth's occupying Easterlings. Hithlum had lasted for 465 years. Another major power of the First Age was the March of Maedhros, founded in 7 of the First Age and ruled by the Sons of Feanor. The March wasn't exactly just one realm, but rather a collection of smaller realms. Himring, ruled by Maedhros, Maglor's Gap, ruled by Maglor, Himlad, ruled by Celegorm and Curathin, Thargelion, ruled by Coranthir, and the lands around Amon Ereb, ruled by Amrod and Amras. Of these lands, only Himring and Amon Ereb would survive the Battle of Sudden Flame, and while the Feanorians would retake their lost territories, their power was broken after the Battle of Unnumbered Tears in 472, and the March fell. It had existed for 465 years as well, but technically you could argue that it survived a little longer because several of the surviving sons did reoccupy Amon Ereb as a personal refuge for at least a few more years, but they lost this in 540. So, at most, 533 years. Alright, I promise you that we're done with the First Age for a bit. The next kingdom is rather interesting because it was occupied on 3 separate occasions. Maybe pause the video and take a guess. The answer is Erebor, the Lonely Mountain. It was originally founded by Thrain I in 1999, but was abandoned by Thorin I in 2210, occupied for 211 years. It was then reoccupied by Thror, the legendary king under the mountain, in 2590, but was lost to Smaug in 2770, 180 years this time. But at last it was retaken in 2941 following the death of Smaug and the Battle of the Five Armies, and remained the kingly seat of Durin's folk to the War of the Ring, a period of 78 years. So we have 469 years in total, but to be fair, Erebor is still occupied come the 4th Age, and would remain so at least until Durin the 7th retakes Moria. Up next is one of the best known kingdoms in Middle-earth, Rohan, the land of the Horse Lords. Funnily enough, when Legolas is in Rohan, he actually comments on how short a time it's been since the kingdom was founded, but by regular human standards, Rohan is quite old. It was founded in 2510 after Steward Kirion gifted the province of Carnevali to Eorl the Young. Since that time, the kingdom weathered many wars and was almost destroyed in the long winter of 2758-59, but it survived and was relatively prosperous by the War of the Ring. When Legolas made his comment, Rohan was 509 years old and would likely end up much older than that. Up next is Rhudaur, one of the 3 Arnorian successor states which were founded in 861 of the Third Age following the breakup of the kingdom. Of the 3 states, Rhudaur had the smallest population of Dunedain, and thanks to the wars that followed, this population only grew smaller. Around 1300, the line of Isildur in Rhudaur was gone, and the kingdom had been taken over by the native hillmen, who ended up siding with Angmar, which sealed the fate of the kingdom. Angmar kept Rhudaur around as an ally for an attack in 1356, but in 1409, Angmar no longer saw the point of a free Rhudaur, annexing the kingdom, ending its independence. Rhudaur had lasted for 548 years. The next kingdom played an important yet underrated role in the Third Age. This is the Kingdom of Rhovanion, although sources indicate that at least initially it was less of a kingdom and more a collection of loosely associated princes. The exact foundation of Rhovanion is unknown. We know only that in 1250 a prince named Vidugavia, the self-styled king of Rhovanion, received Gondor's favour. As Gondor's ally, Rhovanion would provide troops on many occasions, but the kingdom was heavily hit by the Great Plague of the 17th century and never truly recovered. In 1856, the invading Wainriders would defeat Gondor and Rhovanion at the Battle of the Plains, and Rhovanion fell. The survivors then fled to the Vales of Anduin. Rhovanion had existed for at least 606 years. Now, we travel back in time again to one of the most consequential places in Middle-earth, Angband. Technically, Angband was founded thousands and thousands of years ago, but it existed as the westernmost of Morgoth's many fortresses at that time. However, after Morgoth was defeated during the Battle of Powers, Angband survived much more intact than other places, and Morgoth rebuilt it upon his return to Middle-earth in 1495 of the Years of the Trees. From there, Morgoth would wage his wars upon Beleriand, but on the cusp of his victory, the Valar would retaliate. In 587, at the end of the War of Wrath, Angband was utterly destroyed. It had served as Morgoth's primary fortress for 635 years. I just spoke about Rhovanion before. Those Northmen who survived would flee into the Vales of Anduin and would become a new people, the Aethiod. From 1856 of the Third Age, the Aethiod dwelt in the Middle Vales of Anduin, but in 1977, after Angmar's defeat, the Aethiod would migrate north to a new home in the Upper Vales of Anduin. They would dwell there until 2510, when Steward Kirion of Gondor requested their aid against the Balkoth Easterlings. The Aethiod, led by Eorl the Young, answered the call, and their intervention would save Gondor's army, and possibly the whole kingdom. As a reward, Kirion gave Eorl the province of Carnarvon, which would become Rohan. The Aethiod are thus the rare state that ended because it upgraded to something better. The Aethiod had lasted for 654 years. Up next is Angmar, founded by the Witch King, the chief of the Nazgul, in the year 1300 of the Third Age. Angmar's mission was to destroy the realm of Arnor, now divided into 3 successor states. Rhudaur turned traitor and was occupied in 1409, Cardolan was ravaged by war in the same year and finally fell to the Great Plague in 1636, and the Witch King finally took Fornost, ending Arthedain in 1974. The following year, Angmar was destroyed by a coalition of Gondor, the Elves, and the survivors of Arnor. But even though the Witch King was driven from the north, his mission was complete. His kingdom, which lasted for 675 years, had turned Eriador into a wasteland. It's only fitting that we now talk about one of Angmar's victims, Cardolan. One of Arnor's successor states, Cardolan initially took part in Arnor's civil wars, but after its own line of Isildur ended and after the rise of Angmar, Cardolan sided with Arthedain against the rising threat. Although it fought bravely, Cardolan was ravaged in the Great Invasion of 1409, being reduced to a rump state that existed in the Barrow Downs. This rump state came to an end in 1636, when the Great Plague killed most of the surviving Dunedain. Cardolan lasted for 775 years, and although one of the last kings of Arthedain, Araval, would make an attempt to resurrect the fallen kingdom, that would quickly fail. Next, we have Mor Eriador. The next realm, although technically a vassal of Lindon, practically stood alone and had a huge impact on history despite its relatively short life. I'm talking about Eregion, founded in 750 of the Second Age by Galadriel or Celebrimbor, depending on your version of history. Eregion ended up being most famous for being the place where Sauron, disguised as Anatar, worked with Celebrimbor to create the world-changing Rings of Power. However, after the elves became aware of Sauron's betrayal, they refused his demands to hand over the rings, so Sauron attacked Eregion in 1695. A 2-year siege followed, but despite the best efforts of the elves, Eregion fell, Celebrimbor was captured and then killed, and the Seven and the Nine ended up in Sauron's hands. Eregion had lasted for 947 years. And yet, even more Eriador. This time I'm talking about Arnor, which might be a controversial one. Arnor was founded alongside Gondor in 3320 of the Second Age by Elendil, with the kingdom initially taking the role as the senior partner over Gondor. But after the deaths of Elendil and Isildur, Gondor broke free and Arnor never reclaimed its former glory, suffering from depopulation and decay. In 861, King Eärendil died, and his 3 squabbling sons split the realm into 3 successor states. Arnor, as a unified realm, had lasted 982 years. But the kings of Arthedain always saw themselves as the legitimate kings of Arnor, and in 1349, King Argaleb I would make this claim public. In that sense, Arnor did actually last for 2095 years. It just comes down to whether you see Arthedain as the direct and only true continuation of Arnor. The next place I'm talking about was actually part of Arnor. I'm talking about Brieland, the town of Bree, and the surrounding villages of Archet, Combe, and Staddle. Honestly, Bree barely qualifies as a realm because as far as we know it didn't even have a true government. However, it gets mentioned because it's unique in being one of the few places that survived the fall of Arnor in 1974. From this point, Bree was on its own and did well enough to survive many perils and reach the War of the Ring. Afterwards, it was reincorporated into Arnor as part of the reunited kingdom. Bree had existed as an independent town for 1045 years. Alongside Bree, we also have the Shire. Now, the Shire was actually founded in 1601 by the brothers Marco and Blanco. However, the land was settled with the permission of King Argaleb II of Arthedain, and the Shire and its inhabitants considered themselves subjects of the king. Like Brieland, it was one of the few places that survived the downfall of the kingdom despite being overrun, and it became independent in the year 1974. Despite many hardships, the Hobbits survived the Third Age, and by the War of the Ring, the Shire had also been independent for 1045 years. Like Bree, it was reincorporated into the reunited kingdom, but as an autonomous, self-governing zone where men weren't allowed to enter. Next, we're back to Umbar, but a different version of Umbar, the Black Númenórean Umbar. To be fair, we don't know much about Black Númenórean Umbar. It presumably became independent following the downfall of Númenor in 3320. We don't know who the city was ruled by or whether it changed hands in the years that followed. What we do know is that in 933 of the Third Age, King Eärendil I of Gondor stormed the city and claimed it for his kingdom. This was the end of Black Númenórean rule in Umbar. It had lasted for 1054 years. However, Umbar's former lords were not done. They did make multiple attempts to retake the city, finally being defeated in 1050. Up next, we talk about the longest survivor of Arnor, Arthedain. As I said earlier, it's debatable whether or not Arthedain was just a continuation of Arnor, but even though it was ruled by the same line, it ruled just a part of the kingdom, it had a separate capital, and it was referred to as a different name. Like the other successor states, Arthedain emerged in 861 and would outlast all of the others, surviving up until 1974, when the Witch King of Angmar finally conquered Fornost, ending the kingdom. Arthedain had survived 1,113 years, over 100 years longer than the unified Arnor did. For the final time, we return to Umbar, Corsair Umbar. Around 1850 of the Third Age, Gondor lost the city for the final time due to pressure on other fronts. The new owners of Umbar were largely of Haradrim origin, but there was undoubtedly still some Black Númenórean renegade Gondorian influence. Umbar would remain a thorn in Gondor's side for the rest of the Third Age, constantly raiding its territory and playing a role in several large invasions. At the time of the War of the Ring, the Corsairs had been operating for 1169 years, but it's implied that Aragorn finally defeated them sometime early in the Fourth Age. Our next place is another survivor from Arnor, and once again it's debatable whether or not it was truly a realm. This time I'm talking about Tharbad, the city on the Gwathlo at the border of Enedwaith and Minhiriath. It was founded at the end of the Second Age, and possibly earlier. When it became independent from Arnor is also up for debate. It could be as early as 1409 when Cardolan was ravaged, but at the latest it was probably 1636 when Cardolan, who owned Tharbad, previously fell. The city survived, although gradually declined over the next 1,000 years, and in 2912 great floods devastated the city, leading to it becoming abandoned. It was independent for at least 1276 years, possibly longer. Okay, now we're getting to those places that seem eternal. Although the next place on the list is far from eternal because like Erebor, it was abandoned and reoccupied multiple times. I'm talking about Dol Guldur, Sauron's first place of return during the Third Age. Once an abandoned elven settlement in Greenwood, it was first occupied by Sauron in 1100 of the Third Age, and he gradually corrupted the forest around him, leading to it being called Mirkwood. This occupation lasted 963 years, for Sauron fled in 2063 when Gandalf came to investigate the old fortress. He returned in 2460, using it to once again direct traffic against the west until the White Council forced him to flee in 2941. This second occupation lasted 481 years. However, just 10 years later, Sauron sent 3 of the Nazgûl to reoccupy Dol Guldur yet again, and the fortress remained in his hands until it was destroyed during the War of the Ring in 3019. This occupation had lasted 68 years. All in all, Sauron's forces controlled Dol Guldur for a period of 1512 years. Our next place is one of the few places in Beleriand that survived a long time. This is the woodland region of Osiriand. It was founded by a group of Nandor who were migrating westwards around 1350 of the Years of the Trees, led by their king Denethor. However, Denethor and much of the Lyquendi army was wiped out in the First Battle of Beleriand, and as a result, the Green Elves took to secrecy and took little part in the future wars in Beleriand. This actually paid off in the long term. As far as we're aware, Osiriand remained one of the only unconquered lands in Beleriand. In 587 of the First Age, Beleriand was destroyed following the War of Wrath, but much of Osiriand actually stayed above the waves and would form part of the heartland of the new elven kingdom of Lindon. Osiriand, as its own realm, lasted 2024 years. Up next are the twin dwarven realms of Nogrod and Belagost in the Blue Mountains. Unfortunately, we don't know when either city was founded, except that it was between 1050 and 1250 of the Years of the Trees. The first date is when the elves awoke, and the second date is when the dwarves were first met in Beleriand. Because these dates are given in Valian years, this isn't actually a short gap, it's actually almost 2,000 solar years. So anyway, Nogrod and Belagost were founded between these dates. Both cities would play a part in the wars in Beleriand for good and ill, and while neither city was taken by Morgoth, they were ruined during the cataclysm that followed the War of Wrath. Some dwarves would remain in the Blue Mountains, while many others would migrate to Khazad-dûm. These two cities were around for at least 2,982 years, but realistically they could have also been around for as many as 4,500 years. Next is the main protagonist of the Third Age, Gondor. Like Arnor, Gondor was founded in 3320 of the Second Age, but unlike Arnor, Gondor grew in strength and prospered for many years. Around the middle of the Third Age, Gondor's fortune started to fade, but nevertheless the kingdom remained a powerful bulwark against Sauron's minions. By the War of the Ring, Gondor had been the shield that guarded the west for 3,120 years, and the kingdom would continue as the main part of the reunited kingdom, apparently for a span of 100 generations, although this may just be a guess. At the end of the Third Age, Gondor was very close to overtaking its predecessor, Númenor. While not in Middle-earth, Númenor did have holdings on the continent, so I'm still counting them. The island was raised at the beginning of the Second Age as a reward for the Edain that fought against Morgoth, and the kingdom was officially founded in 32 of the Second Age, after the migration across the sea was complete. Numenor would eventually rise to become the world's most powerful empire, but unfortunately this rise coincided with Numenor's slide towards the Shadow. After Sauron corrupted the island, Ar-Pharazôn, the last king, would lead the great armament against Valinor, and as punishment, Eru-Ilúvatar would destroy the island. It had lasted for 3,287 years. Up next is the Land of Shadow, Mordor. Sauron first established himself in Mordor around 1000 of the Second Age, and it would be used as his base of operations against Middle-earth for the rest of the age. In 3441, following the War of the Last Alliance, Sauron was overthrown and the power in Mordor was ended. His occupation had lasted 2,441 years. Gondor kept a watch on Mordor to make sure no new evil returned or emerged, but this started to fail by the middle of the Third Age. In 1980 of the Third Age, the Nazgûl returned, reoccupying Sauron's old home, although Sauron himself would not return until 2941. In 3019, Mordor was destroyed once again following the destruction of the One Ring. The second occupation had lasted 1039 years, bringing Mordor's total time as the Land of Darkness to 3,480 years. We now return to the First Age, and this time we're talking about the Falas. The Falas was founded in 1149 of the Years of the Trees after the Maya, Osse, convinced some of the Teleri to remain in Middle-earth by the shores of the sea. Their lord, Círdan, founded the coastal region of the Falas and built the twin havens of Brythombar and Eglarest. Following the return of the Noldor, Círdan would work closely with them, and the Falas would participate in the wars against Morgoth. Unfortunately, this earned Morgoth's ire, and in 473, 1 year after the disastrous Battle of Unnumbered Tears, Morgoth sent an army to raise the Falas. It was successful, but Círdan and other survivors did manage to flee by ship to other safe locations. The Falas lasted 3,836 years. Lasting slightly longer than the Falas was the other major Sindarin realm in Beleriand, Doriath. In 1152 of the Years of the Trees, Elu Thingol and Melian founded Doriath, and Thingol declared himself King of Beleriand. Unlike the Falas, Doriath did not take a particularly active role against Morgoth, and instead, Doriath was most known for its rivalry with the Sons of Feanor, and Thingol's acquisition of a Silmaril through the efforts of Beren and Luthien. The Silmaril would be Doriath's undoing. In 503, Thingol was murdered by dwarves, and the capital, Menegroth, was sacked by an army from Nogrod. The kingdom would survive, now ruled by Dior, the son of Beren and Luthien, but the revival would be short-lived. In 506, the Sons of Feanor launched a surprise attack, and Doriath was finally destroyed, never to rise again. It lasted 3,841 years. The next realm, although quite small, is one of the most iconic places in Middle-earth, Rivendell. It was founded in 1697 of the Second Age by Elrond, who was gathering up survivors from the destruction of Eregion. Following the War of the Elves and Sauron, Eregion would not be rebuilt, and instead Gil-galad would name Elrond his vice-regent, and Rivendell would be his seat. Rivendell would serve as a refuge, a meeting ground, and a mustering point over the ages, even surviving a siege by Angmar in the 14th century of the Third Age. By the time of the War of the Ring, Rivendell had been the home of Lord Elrond for 4,763 years. Unfortunately, Rivendell would not survive long into the Fourth Age. By Aragorn's death in 120, it's implied that Rivendell had been abandoned. Another elven refuge that flies under the radar is Ethelond. It's said to have been founded by 3 ships of survivors from the Falas, which was destroyed in 473 of the First Age. Basically, these elves were like, nope, we're done, we're sailing far, far away, and ended up landing in the land that would become known as Dol Amroth. Ethelond would serve as a haven through the Second and Third Age, seemingly primarily for Nandoran and later Sylvan elves who wished to sail into the west. However, the inhabitants of Ethelond gradually dwindled, and in 1981, only a single boatload of elves remained, preparing to set sail into the west, thereby abandoning Ethelond for good. This ship was forced out to sea in a storm, resulting in the death of King Amroth of Lorien, who dove overboard in an attempt to get back to land to look for his love Nimrodel. Ethelond had been inhabited for 5,539 years. My next two are somewhat controversial. First, I'll talk about Greenwood, or rather, the Woodland Realm, because we know more about it. Now, Nandoran elves did live in Greenwood from the First Age onwards, but we know almost nothing about them during this time. They did have a leader called Lenwë, but he seems to have vanished by the Second Age. The Woodland Realm that appears in the stories was then founded by Sindar elves in 750 of the Second Age, led by a noble from Doriath named Orifer. Under Orifer and later his son Thranduil, the Woodland Realm would retreat northwards as the shadow on the forest deepened. However, it was also the only elven realm that actually grew in terms of population in the Third Age. By the War of the Ring, the Woodland Realm was 5,710 years old, and given the fact that Sylvan elves were less likely to sail into the west, the realm probably survived reasonably long into the Fourth Age. The second one is Lothlorien. Now, Lothlorien was definitely first inhabited by Nandoran elves during the First Age. However, much like Greenwood, we know little about them beyond the existence of Lenwë. Unlike the Woodland Realm, we don't know when Lothlorien ended up with its Sindarin dynasty, the first of which was Amdir, followed by his son Amroth. It's possible that it was also in 750 of the Second Age, and it was probably not much later than that. After the assumed drowning of King Amroth in 1981, the rule of Lothlorien was taken over by Galadriel and Celeborn, who ruled to the War of the Ring and a little beyond. By this point, Lothlorien may have also been as old as 5,710 years. However, unlike Greenwood, Lothlorien was swiftly abandoned in the Fourth Age, described as being empty by the time of Aragorn's death. We're getting to the final few places, so bear with me. The next realm is also an elven realm, Lindon. It was founded in the first year of the Second Age and was the heartland of Gil-galad's new kingdom, which played a major role in the Second Age. It dwindled in strength following Gil-galad's death at the War of the Last Alliance, but it still played an important role against Angmar in the Third Age, when it was ruled by Lord Círdan. By the time of the War of the Ring, Lindon had been around for 6,460 years and seemingly only had a remnant of its former population. But unlike Rivendell and Lothlorien, Lindon was not swiftly abandoned, as some elves are likely to have still lived there by 171 of the Fourth Age. Okay, now we reach our last mortal realm in Middle-earth. Take a moment to guess what it could be. If you guessed Khazad-dûm, you're right. Like Nogrod and Belegost, Khazad-dûm was founded sometime in the First Age after 1050 of the Years of the Trees, possibly after the aforementioned cities because Durin the Deathless founded Khazad-dûm elsewhere from where he was born, or where he awoke rather. Khazad-dûm would experience a golden age all the way up until the War of the Elves and Sauron in the middle of the Second Age. Afterwards, the dwarves would become less open and would dwindle, and they would be attacked by Sauron's servants. But the downfall would come from within. In 1980 of the Third Age, the dwarves accidentally awoke the Balrog, Durin's Bane, and the following year they were forced to abandon the city. The Great Kingdom had come to an end after at least 7,817 years. But we know that sometime during the Fourth Age, Durin the Seventh would retake the city for good. There are 3 places left, but to be fair, this is kind of cheating. The first place was the first home of the first Dark Lord, when he was still known as Melkor. This was Utumno, founded in the far north of Middle-earth sometime around 3,400 of the Valian years. Yes, we're before the Years of the Trees. Utumno's Sindarin name, Udun, literally means hell, if that gives you an idea about what this place was like. Melkor would use Utumno as his base as he tried his best to ruin Arda, but after the awakening of the elves, the Valar decided that direct action needed to be taken. They assailed Melkor, and in 1099 of the Years of the Trees, Utumno was stormed and destroyed. It had been occupied by Melkor for around 11,500 years. You might not have even heard of the next place I'm going to talk about, and to be fair, I don't think I've ever actually mentioned it on my channel before. This is Almoran, the first home of the Valar, on an island in the centre of Middle-earth. It was created in 1900 of the Valian years when Arda looked completely different, and was lit by the 2 lamps, Iluin and Ormal. However, Melkor would topple the 2 lamps in 3450 of the Valian years, resulting in widespread destruction across Arda, including the loss of Almoran. It served as the home of the Valar for around 14,800 years. And where did the Valar go? This is the last place on our list, the Eternal Valinor. After the destruction of Almoran, the Valar created Valinor on the continent of Aman between 3450 and 3500, raising an impassable mountain range called the Pelori and eventually creating the 2 trees. After the awakening of the elves, they were invited to Valinor, but not all came, and some eventually even left after Morgoth destroyed the two trees in 1495 of the Years of the Trees, resulting in the darkening of Valinor. In 1500, Valinor was kept hidden behind the Enchanted Isles so that none from Middle-earth could make it there, but these enchantments were removed in the Second Age, and once again elves could sail to and from the Blessed Land. Unfortunately, the Númenóreans, craving eternal life, invaded in 3319 of the Second Age, and Valinor was removed from the circles of the world, with only elves being able to take the straight path. Whether you consider this the end of Valinor's time on Arda proper, either way, the land of the gods had endured for over 20,000 years at this point. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. I also hope that I managed to include every realm in there. As I was writing it, I was constantly remembering the existence of certain places, and then at one point I decided to include evil realms. And at the end, I decided why not include Almaren and Valinor too. I also hope my logic when it comes to places like the Iron Hills and Lothlorien stands up to scrutiny. Cheers, farewell, and remember, if the Roman state, in all its forms, was in Middle-earth, it would place 16th on the list, between Osiriand and Nogrod/Belagost, as it lasted 2,206 years in one form or another.